Manic and Chill, we're back.
We're back. We're back for the third week in a row, at least.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. Third
yeah.
week in a row. Impressive for us. Congrats, Shane. Congrats, Scott.
He's Scott Connor at Charles Chill FFB. I'm Shane Manila at Shane is the worst. Um, how you been? Well, I guess we'll do that, right?
I'm bummed. Well, I'm not bummed, but I missed you at the Fantasy Expo. I mean, I literally the worst weekend of the year to have the Expo because it was the one weekend where I literally was in another state, even though the Expo is 70 minutes from my house. So just unfortunate, but yeah, I have a sister and she got married, so I guess that's a a halfway decent excuse to not make it. But no, it sounded like it was a great time. It sounded like pretty much everybody that my entire Twitter timeline was followed for 3 days of people that were at the Fantasy Expo. So kind of looking forward to doing it next year, even though as soon as I get there, I'll be like, oh, I don't want to talk to that many people. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds great until you're in the midst of it and you're like, how many more people can I say hey to? What's your Twitter handle? I mean, how did that go? I assume it was a lot of like, well, what do you do? What's your Twitter handle? Who are you? Hey, nice to meet you. We interacted on this
Yeah.
topic 6 months ago. Yeah, tell me about it.
A lot of people that they come up to you and you go, "Hey, remember when we did that live stream?" And you're like, "Yeah." No idea. None at
Yeah, because
all.
Shane's only done like 400 live streams, and who knows how many people have jumped in and out, and you're like, who is that again?
Yeah.
Right?
People are like, "Hey, you've been on my podcast 3 times," and you're like, "Yeah, yeah. If you say so, I am going to believe you." We do a lot of podcasts. We do a lot of live streams. But no, man, it was really awesome. There were more fans there this time than last, which was pretty awesome because you got to talk some strategy with them, but you also got to talk strategy with other fantasy football guys. We're nerds. You leave us alone long enough, and then conversations turn to fantasy football. It was really cool.
Well, I was going to
There,
ask you that because I went in 2019. That's when we first met, actually in person. But like, everyone had booths set up and stuff, but it seemed like it was almost like a lot of the people in the industry that had a website or had a service or had a product that were basically needing each other. But that was my biggest question: was what was it like from like the general public? Like, was there actually interest from like the general public to come and learn about fantasy football? That was my biggest question.
yeah, no, it had a good turnout. Much better than the first one. Shout out to Bob Lung, DoubleTree Hotel. Really great turnout. People were just wandering around, basically coming up to tables and talking to you at the expo. One difference is, they had panels this year like they did the years prior. And I did the panel 2 years ago. I think it was on Dynasty strategy, probably. And I did it again this year. Um, the first time we did it, I think we did it for a group of maybe 8 or 9 people. If I'm being, uh, what's the word?
Generous.
Generous. Yes, yes. 8 or 9 people. This time I didn't keep count, but it was basically a full room, like a full ballroom of people. And that's the way it was for all the panels. Like, I got to step in for a couple other panels because I kept leaving the booth. Um, and they had different panels all day. And I actually got to sit on a panel with, Mike Bowers, Pat Carane, Izzy Alcafas, Rich Dotson, talking about strategy, among other people. Like, it was a really awesome time. And, we had fans, whatever. I hate that word, but that they were able to ask us questions, and it was really awesome. Really awesome.
A little jealous, honestly, just that you got to experience that and hang out for a weekend and talk about Dynasty because I pretty much do that every weekend, except for I don't have thousands of other people that like it. It's usually,
Yeah.
who can I chat with on GroupMe or Slack or Twitter about Dynasty because everyone else in my, I guess, regular life is like, what's Dynasty?
You
What
know,
what is that? I know you play fantasy football, but what's Dynasty? Like, what is Dynasty and Chill? Where do you get that name? And tell me the difference between Dynasty. That's about as far as I get. And I'm like, I'm already tapped out by just explaining it that I don't actually want to talk about it at that point. But no, I'm kind of jealous that you got to do that. I'm looking forward to doing it next year.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely worth it.
So, what's our topic? I know we both been like deep diving on running backs the last couple days, so I think that's kind of where we're just going to naturally flow this show into, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what's wrong with us? What are we like separated at birth? That we're just like, you know what I want to work on? Running backs. And then you go, you know what I want to work on? Running backs. It's not like we planned it because we don't really plan things. But yeah, I've been diving into running backs. You've been diving even deeper into running backs. You we I think we look at things similarly, but I like to look at things from a perspective of why and how we get there. So I was more when I first started looking, I just wanted to see how is the running back one evolving, right? Is it because it we would assume that their receiving work is expanded exponentially, right? Like that's just the assumption you would make just based off of what we see, because we know that their rushing attempts have to be dropping. Um, and what I found is uh maybe, except that last year could have been an outlier because breaking it down into subsections, the top six scoring running backs last year actually averaged less receptions than any year since 2015, which was kind of weird to me. Of course, if you think about it, there was no Saquon, right? And there was no Christian McCaffrey. But by the
Well, we
same
also
token,
lost Tariq Cohen.
Tariq Cohen,
We also lost Austin Eckler for a big part of the year. I
right,
mean,
right.
that definitely impact. We saw pass catchers go down probably at a higher rate than typical last year. So maybe that contributed to it a little bit.
Yeah, and you would think that, and except that for every season you look at, you could find a reason as to why something happened if you really wanted to. We talked about 2018 being an outlier too, because you had Tariq Cohen, who had less than 100 rushing attempts, was a top 12 running back. Um, so it's just interesting, and I'm trying to finish up an article, trying to come up with some conclusions. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not coming up with any of the conclusions that I hoped. I hope to find something just nice and clean. You know, the new running back one is going to average 100 targets and 70 receptions a year. Except that that's not what I found. I found that it fluctuates. Um, it's been fluctuating yearly. It's increased since 2015, and then it started to decrease, the receptions and the targets. It peaked in 2018, and again, that's probably a lot to do with Tariq Cohen. They averaged about 100 targets a year, the top six running backs, scoring running backs overall. And this year, it's down to, excuse me, that was targets. And this year prior, actually, it just dropped down to 60. Um, and even the year before in 2019, when we had a healthy Austin Eckler and we had a healthy Christian McCaffrey, it was still only 79 targets. Um, unfortunately, what I found so far is there's not going to be a clear cut. This is what a running back one gets, or this is how you get to a running back one. And I think I'll let you talk about this more, but I think what we have found is that the running back one is too broad of a term.
Oh yeah, I mean the stark deficit. I mean, we'll just kind of lead into what you brought up that I had looked into was essentially trying to find. And truthfully, this came about because I'm preparing for our FFPC main events, and one of the big things that's been trending this year has been the hero RB or the modified zero RB, and Rotoviz has done this data back to 2013, 2012, but it really, when you look more into it, I've shifted towards this mentality for Dynasty too, only because you're right. I mean, when you say this guy can be an RB1, I wanted to find out, okay, what does that mean? Is it and I guess you could almost classify it after doing the research of like, you have like an RB plus plus plus, which essentially, I mean, I looked back at the last 10 years worth of data and just looked at each spot, RB1 to RB20, RB24. So I just looked at each spot, took the average finish of points, receptions, total touches, and then looked at the deviations between each spot. So kind of just looked at like where do you see like the major drops? Where are the big swoons in terms of like the tier breaks? And yeah, when you say RB1, it's like RB plus 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 is when you hit on one of these seasons where a guy averages 25 points a game. And it's like, that player is literally breaking the position, compared to the other players. I mean, compared to like the RB10, I mean, the RB1 overall on average, I mean, is just crushing the RB10 to the point where it's almost like 1.75 times what the RB10 is. So to call them both an RB1, it's like, okay, that's not really describing what they actually are. But what was curious though was when you just break down RB1s, there's basically 4 tier breaks. Curiously, the biggest gap between RB1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 24, the biggest gap of all of them between one to the next was RB1 and RB2, more than 11% difference. So that just says if you hit on one of these guys that has one of these, David Johnson, Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara seasons, like that is worth as much or more as hitting on the elite QB or elite tight end season, right? Like, I mean, it's a super, super positional advantage. The problem is it's hard to predict. There's probably only, if I just told you that on average, what it takes to be the hit one of these Uber RB1 plus 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 seasons, 340 touches, 270 rushing attempts, and at least 70 catches. So just keep those numbers in mind broadly. I mean, how many running backs right now in the NFL can catch more than 70 passes in a season? You probably count them on one hand, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit about that pregame. Just looking at the receptions last year for running backs, there was 3 that had more than 60 receptions last year. 3.
Right now, add in. I don't even want to say 270 because that's just the average, but add in now you have to take an additional 250 rushing attempts. So out is Tariq Cohen, out is J.D. McKissick, out is James White. Any of those guys that, okay, yeah, they could have an 80 catch season if they hit everything right, but they're not coming anywhere close to the overall workload. So I think the point is you have to not only be an elite receiver, but you have to be basically a guy that's on the field all the time and you're taking all the touches. And there's just not a lot of coaches, even if you have a skill set that can do that, there's not many coaches that are even going to allow that. They're not going to allow, especially if you have one of these guys like Kamara or McCaffrey that are like your premier weapon in your offense. How many coaches are going to let that guy go out there and have 300 carries or 270 carries? It doesn't make sense. You know what I mean?
No.
Like you want to try to use them in the most efficient ways, which is typically not 270 carries on top of your 70 catches. So it's just an outcome that's almost impossible to predict. You basically have to predict a guy to not only do that, but stay healthy the entire season to hit one of these seasons. Just to kind of go to the next tier, though, you have RB2s, which is interesting. The RB2s are the second biggest difference-making position. The RB2 and the RB3 is the second biggest gap of all of them. But it's curious, what makes up an RB2 typically is actually more total touches, but less receptions and less targets. So if you just prototype these guys, you have a guy like Barkley, McCaffrey, Kamara. Those are probably your RB1 guys, right? The guys that could have the 70, 80. And obviously, if you have 100 catches, you don't need 270 carries. You can probably get away with like 200 and still get there.
Yeah, you just don't want, again, bringing up the Tariq Cohen season of
Correct.
100 rushing attempts.
Correct. RB2, to me, if I prototype the RB2s, that's probably more like your Ezekiel Elliott, Jonathan Taylor, Dalvin Cook. Like they're never going to have the 70-plus reception season, but they could get to 60, 55, 60. But they could also handle 300 touches or more, 300 carries or more on top of their receptions. The average number of rushing attempts was 290 for an RB2. The average number of receptions was 65. So you're talking more total touches. So these are just like the guys that get all the volume. So to me, I look at those and say, that's even less predictable. I mean, you're telling me this guy has to get 360 touches to get to an RB2 level? That's a hard bet to make. You know what I mean? That's a tough bet to get through a season and say that that's going to happen. I mean, that's an outlier type season. But again, that's an RB2. And again, they're difference making, but not as much as the RB1s. And then as you go down the line, it's like RB3 stands alone. It's kind of a mixture of both. You still need a lot of touches, and it's still a floor of like, the numbers were 52 catches. So you still have to be think in the RB3 range as like Aaron Jones. Like he gets 50 plus catches, never going to be elite, and he's never going to get as much work as like a JT or Zeke. But he's going to be the best of both worlds. And sometimes you can elevate these numbers a little bit with touchdowns, with really high yards per carry as well. But I look at a guy like Aaron Jones and I'm like, dude, RB3 is like his absolute ceiling, just the way that the Packers use him. But there's still not many guys that have this range of outcome. Then the next tier, I found it was RB4 through 6. And I know I'm rambling on a little bit, but RB4 through 6, I think you can justify a lot of players could hit into this range, but it still requires you to get a lot of touches. I mean, the average to be an RB4 through 6, you're still having to touch the ball almost 300 times. But to me, this is the ceiling for guys like Najee Harris or Joe Mixon. Like their best case scenario is around this range. And guess what the difference is between an RB4 through 6 and even the RB3? It's still less, more than 5% gap. And that's just the RB3. It's a 25% gap to the RB1. So I'm just throwing this out there to think of like, even if I told you Najee Harris would have his best season ever, it'll be 75% of what Christian McCaffrey's peak would be.
And what's that look like in scoring? Not percentage of scoring, but actual
scoring. You're looking at RB4 through 6. You're around 18 to 19 points per game PPR.
Versus 25 or so at running
24.8 at RB1.
Right.
So you're talking more than a 25% difference between the two positions, or almost a 25% difference between the two. So, and I bring this up only because if you just apply this to dynasty values, right? Like if I just told you that Najee Harris's best outcome ever is 75% of Saquon Barkley or Christian McCaffrey at their peak. All you're betting on is which one is going to be able to stay healthy, which one is going to last longer. But when you're talking about impact, or like best ball people would say, like win rates, right? You know, like you're not necessarily moving the needle with these guys. That's where it starts to fall down. And then when you get past the RB6, RB like 7 through 10 is almost like where you cut it off. I mean, that is where probably the majority of players are going to fall that we would consider to be like high caliber NFL running backs. But that's not a guarantee. I mean, that's probably where your Nick Chubbs, your Joe Mixons, like that's where they're most likely to fall if they stay healthy. And that's kind of depressing, right? Like if I told you that's basically their best range of outcomes is that RB7 through 10, and it's like 60 to 70% what an elite running back season is, like why do we pay so much for those guys? You know what I mean? And then anyway, it really flattens off. Once you get past like RB10, the difference between like RB10 and RB24 in terms of impact, when you especially look at this as a week-to-week game, any Jag can be an RB18 on a week. Can I project them to get 16 touches? Really good chance they're going to be an RB18 or an RB20. So I guess just be careful when you value guys in that range, because they could go higher, but really you're probably overpaying more for what you know. You're overpaying for a guy like David Montgomery because he did it last year. You're overpaying for him because he had a good profile and he had good draft capital. But that's it. You know, if you gave the same opportunity to a guy that's 6 rounds lower in a startup, chances are he probably could produce the same thing. And I think we know that inherently, but we don't behave that way when we're talking values. You get in the startup and it's like, oh, I have to draft David Montgomery because he's the last running back of the tier. And it's like, just understand that's a really low expected value pick. That is basically picking a placeholder. And a lot of times we draft those guys because we're drafting out of fear. We want to feel safe about the guy we pick. Well, he has a safe workload. And it's like the safe workloads at running backs can evaporate like that. So I don't know. That was my main takeaway. But it just strengthens the fact that why would you ever prioritize an RB 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, unless you believe that guy has probably a top 6 or better ceiling? It really makes no sense to pay at that price. You almost are better off just kind of punting and going 0 RB at that point.
Yeah, you know, and my takeaway from this and a couple of other things we've discussed and talked about before is And again, and this is in your standard 9, start 10 leagues, right? Most
Yep.
leagues are probably that. So that's what I'm speaking to. You really want to consolidate and get like absolute superstars and stop thinking of in terms of running back 1, right? Wide receiver 1. Start thinking in terms of who's top 6 in production at that position. For quarterback, you can go a little lower, up until probably quarterback 10 or so. Are the guys that really make a difference compared to the other players in the league. And then tight end, obviously, you have 5, right? 5 maybe. And I've always been a guy like depth doesn't matter. This just furthers that opinion for me. Depth doesn't matter. And again, this is in start 9, start 10. If you're starting 11, 12, 13, it's a whole different thing, obviously. But I'd much rather take my chances with, and spend all the capital I need it to on a CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Lamar Jackson type of team, really top heavy, than going, all right, well, I have a bunch of wide receiver 3s, that or wide receiver 2s and things like that, or running back 2s.
Well, and I think another thing to consider that you kind of said it, but I'll say it in a slightly different way just so people can visualize it. If you just picture what the distribution of points on a weekly basis looks like, think of an NFL season, and then you look back at, okay, what did the top 50 running back scores look like this week? You'll see a drop-off point to where you can clearly tell based on those points. It's like that's where the usage dropped off. The touches started to fall off right at that range. And it's usually right around like RB30 in a given week. The points just kind of drop off the table. And that's not because RB31 and RB28 are any difference in terms of talent, but there's only so much opportunity to be had at the running back position. Typically that's more of a finite number week to week, and it may be distributed different ways on different teams, but there's less relevant numbers of running backs each week. So the drop off is more significant. At wide receiver, if you look, you'll see some weeks where it's like, okay, this guy was a wide receiver 3. He was a wide receiver 3 that week, Shane. He averaged 11 points. Yeah, he scored 11.7 PPR points. And it's like the wide receiver 58 scored 9.9. So what's the difference? Truthfully, what was the difference? Except for one gets credit for being a wide receiver 3, and the other gets credit for being wide receiver 58, which we don't even talk about. And the difference between the two was like 1.5 points. Whereas at running back, 1.5 points is 9 and RB12 or RB9 and RB16. You know what I mean? Like it's all in the same range. So running back's just a little bit different, which is why, and I don't have these numbers in front of me, but the points follow the touches. The points follow the opportunity. That is not the case necessarily at other positions. I mean, you can throw in a tight end and say he's going to get 6 targets, but if he sucks and he's a stiff and he can't go anywhere with the ball and he doesn't score a touchdown, a tight end can have a 4 for 22 game with no touchdowns, not relevant, right? 7 targets, 4 catches, 22 yards, not relevant. Yet if you give if you give Noah Fant 7 targets a game, he's probably going to do a lot more with those 7 targets than the 3rd string tight end that also got 7 targets. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it's like exactly. Running back is the position where, this is where the running backs don't matter comes from, is like, yes, talent matters to a degree, but it's a volume game. It's a volume game at running back, which is why you can design the rosters. You said depth doesn't matter. I agree it doesn't matter, except for probably more so at running back, just having enough guys to get through a season. You're supplementing your weak high-end guys with more types of running backs on the back end. And I just did a Patreon pod about this too, where I'm like, if I have this type of player, if I have Derrick Henry as my RB1, I probably want more backups like Tony Pollard. I want a guy that if things break his way, the 2% outcome, Tony Pollard, if Zeke were to tear an ACL during the season, Tony Pollard probably jumps up into that range where he's capable of like an Aaron Jones type season. You know what I mean? That's in his range of outcomes. I want to pair him with a guy like Derrick Henry. If I have Christian McCaffrey already, give me a bunch of Ronald Jones, Phillip Lindsay. Give me that can like RB20 finishes, I'll still beat everybody in the league because I have that high-end guy that's supplementing it. So it's you want to have kind of like different types of backup running backs too on your team. You don't want to have all the this guy needs 18 touches to score any points. You want some different types. So that's another thing to think about is there's so many running backs out there, but just envision, hey, when I tell you a name, you think about how they would score points if you ever needed to use them. And then you can kind of correlate that with the different players and the different combos that you have.
It's funny, you look at Derrick Henry last year, 378 rushes, over 2,000 yards, 17 touchdowns. And he was just the RB5 because he only had 19 receptions. Yep. But yeah, Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook. Well, Dalvin Cook really is like the absolute like prototype of what you want. 312 rushing attempts and 54 targets. Or Christian McCaffrey when he's healthy. So you got to look at the running back. Looking at the running back landscape, who's the guy? There's one guy I think everyone says could be that guy, right? Antonio Gibson, but mostly because we say he was a wide receiver in college. Yep. So we say, okay, well, he could definitely do it. Travis Etienne never can make this, could he? He'll never get enough rushing attempts, would he? Be able to make that top 6 without an outlier.
I mean, he would need, he would need the to do it. He would need like the Austin Eckler type season from a couple years ago, where his receptions are not just 65, 70, they're 90 plus. And I don't, this is completely anecdotal, but like when you want to project a guy to get 90 plus receptions, that is almost purely a coaching decision and a scheme decision. And those things are unpredictable. You know, we can look back at a guy like Antonio Gibson and be like, he could have been Christian McCaffrey, but you know what? The coach never used him that way, and we're never going to get to see it. And there's a lot of guys that we wish, if he was in a better situation, he would be able to be, you know, could J.K. Dobbins be Dalvin Cook? If he was on the Vikings, maybe. But you know what? We're never going to see it. And it doesn't matter. You can argue till you're blue in the face that he's a better prospect than Dalvin Cook, but it's never going to matter, which is our argument against Dobbins is like, he's great, but it's just not going to matter. And, you know, a running back is on the same team that drafted him for 4 or 5 years. And that is all of the time he's valuable in Dynasty. So, you know, where they get drafted, if it's not a good landing spot and the coach wants to run, you know, split the 450 touches to the running backs 4 different ways throughout the season, then I'm sorry, the running back's just screwed. I mean, that's just
here's the problem with J.K. Dobbins is he would basically, just to get into that Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara is the outlier of outliers because he's going to have 80 receptions every season. But just to get into that realm, he needs to double not just his rushing work, he also needs to double his receiving work. Could I see one of those things happening if I put on my J.K. Dobbins colored glasses? Yes. Can I see both those things happening? I don't. And I love J.K. Dobbins. You know, you put J.K. Dobbins in Minnesota, I think he rushes for 2,000 yards and could, you know, have 500, 600 yards receiving. But like you said, unfortunately, I don't see the path for that ever happening while he's there. So we think it could be an Antonio Gibson, right? Like he's one guy that it could be. Could be Austin Eckler if he stays healthy. Nick Chubb is another guy that it's just not going to happen, right?
Yeah, Nick Chubb is another one that, I mean, and again, you can make up some of the gap with insane efficiency. I mean, if you get 5.5 yards per carry and you're still getting 250 rush attempts, you're gonna post 30 to 40 more points because of your rushing yards. You're going to rush for a lot of yards if you do that. You know, if you're averaging 5.5 yards per carry and you get 250 carries, well, you're up in the 1,400 yard range, which is that's going to be more points. If you have one of these outlier seasons where you rush for 17 touchdowns like Derrick Henry, like you're going to rush for, you know, you're going to score more points that way, but it just doesn't catch up fast enough. I mean, you can look at J.K. Dobbins last year. And he had 158 touches, okay? And he had 925 yards. So 158 touches, 925 yards, and he scored, and this is as a rookie, he scored 9 touchdowns, right? So not bad for a rookie. What if I told you you could double his stats last year? Double them. And he's still 2.5 points less per game than what that RB1 number is.
Yep.
And you're talking double them, which means you give him immediately 340 touches and he scores 18 touchdowns and he's still an RB3. And it's like, that's just the math, So if you want to bet on a 340 touch season for J.K. Dobbins and 1,800 scrimmage yards and 18 touchdowns, then go for it. But if he does that and he's still not even a top 2 running back, then it's just hard to make that bet, especially when he's peaked in his value. He's valued as a top 8 or 10 running back in Dynasty. It just screams sell. You know what I mean?
I got 2 guys that I definitely think can do it.
Okay.
DeAndre Swift.
Okay.
And last year's bust, Clyde Edwards-Helaire.
We'll start with Swift. I think Swift. So this is just me kind of just forecasting what I think about Swift. I think Swift can probably hit some of these benchmarks, but I think what really also contributes to, we didn't talk about these, but what contributes to some of these mega seasons too is, like McCaffrey in his great seasons or Todd Gurley in his great seasons. They're getting so many sheer touches. They're getting all of the valuable touches too. So not only are they getting the receptions, but they're getting, you got some 17, 18, 20 touchdown seasons mixed in there. So, that's how you truly hit the peak. If we remove touchdowns, this might be a little interesting to look at some of this data. If you just took away touchdowns and assumed they're all random, which isn't fair to say. But I think with Swift, it's like you're probably not going to get the yards per carry efficiency point, and you're probably not going to get the touchdowns. So, yeah, I think he could get there in the other categories, but where does that leave him? You know what I mean? Like, where does that allow him to fall? So is he capable? Yes. Unfortunately, the prime of his rookie deal is falling on a team where it's not a great situation. So that's what kind of hurts Swift a little bit. But I agree. He's one of those guys that if he was on a different team, you'd probably say he has the skill set to do it. And then Edwards-Helaire, he feels a little Austin Eckler-ish, doesn't he? Where it's like that's how he should probably be used, but we know the Chiefs don't throw to the running back like that. So
yeah,
I don't know.
So here's the thing, and we forget how good his season actually was because he did not pay off. People were drafting him as the RB3. I don't even know. It was something ridiculous. But he had 55 targets last year. And some of that was in a severely limited part-time role when they were trying out all these other running backs. From all indications, the training wheels are off this year, right? So could he see 90 targets and maybe 200 rushing attempts? Again, and it's hard to figure out a Pat Mahomes offense because Pat Mahomes could decide that he's going to throw for 60 touchdowns and that they're all going to be to Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. So there's always that, which, you have that great of a quarterback. It's a little hard to put up that season. Even Aaron Jones hasn't been able to put up that RB1 season. Partly, it benefits him from a real football perspective, having Aaron Rodgers on his team. But it also holds him back. There's no reason to give him the ball 340 times. But if I could see anyone else doing it, that's where I see Helaire, because he definitely has the overall skill set for it. And he's already shown a little preview of it, even though we think last year was a bad year for him.
Well, and he's been a good buy because his price has been depressed. If I told you that his ceiling was his absolute best season and his ceiling was going to be in that RB4 to 6 range, he hasn't cost that price though. So compared to some of the other guys that are more expensive, the bang for your buck, you would say, actually is higher with him. You can get him a little bit cheaper, at least earlier in the offseason. You could get him cheaper than Dobbins, but I could argue if you hit the top 20% outcome with both of those guys, it may be higher with Edwards-Helaire. So, and to me, that's what I'm chasing. I'm not chasing the median outcomes. I'm chasing if I buy this guy, if he's going to help me win my league, most likely I'm going to have to hit one of the top 10, 20% range of outcomes. I mean, that's what I'm looking for with any roster. You know what I mean? You're making decisions to try to hit the upper range of outcomes, just like you're trying to finish in the top 1 or 2 of your league. Who cares if you finish 5th or 6th? It doesn't matter. I think the guy that probably could have done it, that has like the mix of everything, including maybe the offensive efficiency, unfortunately, was Akers. And he's now dead. So that was one of those where he was valued that way, but I wouldn't have been shocked, especially because we saw the Rams offense do it just 3 years ago with another guy. Like, I wouldn't have been shocked if he would have had that range in his range of outcomes, but we're never going to be able to see it. I think the other 2 guys besides the one you mentioned, I think Mixon and Najee Harris. Now, these are low odds bets, but I wouldn't be shocked if those guys, and obviously they have to stay healthy, and they're potentially both on teams that aren't going to be efficient because they're not going to have good offensive lines. But I think just if you tell me they could get the brakes run off of them, I wouldn't be shocked if those 2 guys could do it, but also hit that 50 reception minimum too that it takes to crack the top 4 or top 3. But those are low bets. I mean, you really want to bet on Joe Mixon, who's never finished higher than the RB9 to finish in the top 6? Probably not. Do you want to bet on a rookie Najee Harris to finish in the top 3 or 4 when, you know, relatively speaking, he wasn't even a better prospect than 4 or 5 guys from last year? Probably not. But, you know, if you told me that's what it's going to take, yeah, I think those will be the 2 guys that I'd forecast. But we don't have anybody that has McCaffrey, Kamara range of outcomes. And I'm not sure if we're going to see many of those guys come into the NFL, quite frankly, over the next couple of years.
They are unicorns.
They are.
Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook went healthy, and if he does it again this year, then I'll have to put him in the Christian McCaffrey tier. To be quite frank, they are unicorns. We were talking about, we're old, so I looked at 2001. I mean, obviously they're never going to get as many touches as these guys, but they're in the mold of Priest Holmes and Marshall Faulk. And what's funny is 20 years ago, I thought those 2 were starting a revolution in the fantasy and football, just in football in general. And that revolution is not fully hit yet, even though you kind of thought it would, because that seems like the prototype perfect player, a guy that can run the ball, in Marshall's case, 300 times with 100 targets. But for whatever reason, that has not happened yet, that revolution. So one actionable item I think we should give people, and I'm actually doing it in my leagues, I'm going to be offering up some J.K. Dobbins for Clyde Edwards-Helaire and a later pick, just to see if I can get it. Get something back on the back end, because, like I said, I love Dobbins. You know that. He was my favorite running back coming out last year. I think everyone loves Dobbins' talent. But, yeah, looking at their outcomes, who's likely more likely to pay off at their price, I would say it's Helaire.
Yeah, and I'm never I like that idea, because you're not paying the sticker market price in terms of, you're not paying it in terms of like draft picks to buy a running back. You know, if you're going out and trying to buy a high-end running back when they're 2 or 3 years into their career and the other team wants draft picks, it's like, yeah, give me 3 firsts. Mm-hmm. And almost always that's a bad bet to give up 3 firsts for, truthfully, unless it's a quarterback or maybe a tight end. I have a hard time really giving up 3+ firsts for any skill player, just because there's so much variance at the position. But if I was going to buy a running back, and I think I only have 2 shares of this guy across all my leagues, I think Barkley's the one to buy. And you can tell me, oh, he's not going to get a full workload and he's not going to be fully ramped up until week 4. But I kind of looked at the impact. If you were to say he even hits that RB2, RB3 range, because maybe he doesn't. I think he had 71 catches in his rookie year. I don't remember offhand exactly what it was. Like, I'm not sure if he can get to the 80-90 range, but I think he can get to the 70 range, or at least from a points per game perspective, I think he can jump up into that top 2 or 3. But even if he's not fully ready, if you're telling me I'm going to get that for 10 to 12 games, I will take that all day over 17 games of Derrick Henry or 17 games of J.K. Dobbins. I'll figure it out for the month that he's not there. But I think that's the guy.
Yeah, 91 receptions, 261 rushing attempts. Yeah, there you go. There's the
I undersold him then. For some reason 71 came to mind, but not. I mean, dude, if he hits that was in one of those dominant alpha seasons for a running back. And so yes, is he ever going to be able to stay healthy? Is he ever going to be able to do that again? That's what your bet.
And there's no way to know that. But what we do know is that he has the ability to do it if he stays healthy because he's done it before. Um, Scott has frozen. He's probably been attacked by one of his rescue cats because if you didn't know, Charles is also a good person and he rescues cats. Scott is a good person and rescues cats. But yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up. We're about 40 minutes in, so we did a little baby one today. Scott, where can people find you?
I'm back. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's a good show. I think this was like really us going into the weeds on running backs. But yeah, at Charles Chill FFB, Dynasty and Chill. DLF, I'll actually be returning and doing the waiver/transaction column this year for DLF. So that will be, look forward to that. First one dropping here. I'll try to hit one before week 1 because that's a huge week to react to all the training camp and preseason cuts and whatnot. But yeah, occasionally at DLF. But yeah, it's a good time hanging out with you, Shane, as always.
It's one of my favorite shows to do. Manic
Hell
and
yeah.
chill.
Hell yeah.
It's best of both worlds. It's manic and it's chill.
It is.
I'm at Shane is the worst. Dynasty Trades HQ, fantasy or dynasty intervention, and then also writing for DLF when writing actually makes me when there's something that inspires me, which isn't very often. But whatever, I'll write something shortly. Go join one of our patrons, Dynasty and Chill, or at Dynasty Trades HQ, whichever, or join them both. Best of both worlds. That's it. Good night, DLF.
Good night, DLF.